The night was silent and calm at St. Julia's Hospital. The doctors were tranquil and content. The patients slept comfortably in their beds, and there had been no deaths today. All was good in the serene building. Amidst the tranquil setting, Tonya lay awake on the bunk bed in the residence corner, thinking about what life would bring to her after this residency was done. Perhaps she'd move to New York, a bigger city where life would throw at her opportunities not available in Virginia. Maybe she'd even find the love of her life, or if things went well between her and Marcus, she could tell him what tugged her heart. "Tonya!" Layla came rushing into the room, frantically searching for her stethoscope. "We need all the hands we can have right now. A large emergency is coming up. More than half a dozen cases. Freak accident, I suppose. Get ready." Tonya groaned and stood up, irritated at herself for feeling bitter at the few minutes of peace that were now broken by the casualties. Moreover, she also felt a heat burning up in her heart for Layla. She was the perfect woman in every way. Mature, focused, beautiful and kind. She was trying her best to develop a relationship with Andrew Robertson, Marcus's best friend. Tossing out the bittersweet thoughts from her head, she got up and fixed a mask on her face, determined not to daydream on call today. She looked at herself in the mirror before stepping out, reminding herself of all the odds that had gotten her here today. She would take full advantage of the potential life had given her, especially today. "Is everyone ready?" Professor Eric Robertson yelled while coming out of his office. Tonya was surprised to see him, that too in a good way. To them, he was Andrew's dad, but to the outside world, he was more of a legend in the medical sphere, operating only on the brains of the most exclusive patients, the billionaire sort, and he was damn great at it. Today, Prof. Eric had decided to scrap off the guise of being the untouchable doctor. Today, Prof. Eric had decided to work in the most ordinary of settings, the emergency room. "Incoming!" Dr. Alice Marjorie yelled, fixing a cap on her head and glancing at the old professor with a smile on her face. 26 years in this field had certainly taken a toll on her. Her eyes were tired and the lines around them showed the weight of the pain of the patients she had carried through all this time. "I just spoke to the paramedics. It's a case of mass poisoning. There are 7 patients in total." "Alex Torres, have you prepared the beds?" "Yes, ma'am," Alex replied, determined to prove herself over the fact that he was the newest and youngest amongst them all. "Luckily, there are exactly 7 of us to handle the cases." Dr. Willis replied, her eyes focused on the glass doors, her ears attentive to the sounds of the typical sirens that should have been audible by now. But that was not the case. Instead, a lone fleet of 7 ambulances quietly drove to the main gate, not making the slightest fuss at all. Tonya and the rest stared at the fleet in visible confusion for quite a plethora of reasons, the biggest being that they'd never seen these types of large, all-black ambulance vehicles in their life before. Certainly not in Virginia before today. "Quickly, get them!" Dr. Willis rushed forward, not letting the confusion make her judgment fussy, especially not at this critical hour. She grabbed the nearest stretcher being unloaded and slid it quickly into a cubicle in the emergency room, glancing at the patient once to see their current state. Tonya grabbed another patient, bringing them inside and preparing to give them fluids. That was until she glanced at their face with attention. A cold wave of oddness swept over her as she stood there, dumbfounded and shocked. "Andrew?" "Yeah, what's up?" Andrew's voice echoed over from a few curtains away. "Real busy." Tonya stepped away from the body, not noticing Andrew's voice that had been cut off from shock. Her eyes were fixated on the body in front of her, the cyanotic blue skin that was sickly and dying, the dull, lifeless eyes that begged to be safe, and most of all, the unsettling nurse that had just appeared in front of her, standing behind the bed and glaring at her deep in the eyes. There was something rather eerie about the woman. She was as if an amateur had drawn a human from memory. All the features were normal, yet as a whole her face was bizarre. The eyes were set too wide apart, her lips were too thin, and her skin too smooth and papery. Tonya felt as if she were looking right through her. In her masked black hand was an old-fashioned stopwatch, clicking away noisily. "Everyone!" Dr. Ellis's voice boomed through the floor as he walked past the curtains. "I need a full view of all the patients, so kindly draw away the curtains." Tonya swept the curtain away, exposing Andrew's body to the entire room. She watched in horror as one by one the curtains were pushed to the sides, revealing the bodies behind them. Behind every bed stood an eerie nurse, as catatonic as a robot, only the stopwatches ticking away noisily in the room. In their sheer panic, they had failed to realize that the 7 bodies that had appeared were theirs. Every patient was a duplicate of a doctor in the room. Tonya peered around quickly, catching sight of a head of curly hair that was unmistakably hers. Marcus looked down at her with a grief-stricken stillness on his face. At this distance, she couldn't tell what was wrong with her alternate self. "Is this some sort of sick joke?" Layla gasped, looking at her doppelganger that lay with Prof. Eric. "It doesn't make sense." "It soon shall," a voice boomed from the end of the room. It was from behind the bed of Tonya's doppelganger. The nurse stepped out, lightly pushing Marcus from the way. "It will soon all be clear as a drop of fresh water from a melting glacier." "Lady, what the hell?" Alex Torres's voice echoed into the quiet hospital. "Not hell, not yet," she smiled. "You're all in purgatory. All of you are frozen in time here. And the test that lies in front of you will determine the fate of your very being." Dr. Ellis stepped in front of the monotonous woman, observing her from top to bottom with a frown on her face. "I'm calling the authorities. This looks to be some sort of terrorist cult, kids." She fished for a phone from her scrub pocket and dialed a 3-digit number with it, holding it against her ear for a good 15 minutes before it shut down. The nurse's eyes glimmered dangerously. "I'm afraid that will not be happening. Do you not see, Alice? You are not in the mortal realm. You are all either dead or close to it anyways." "What are these?" Marcus cried, pointing at the stretches of dying doppelgangers that lay around the room. His scrunched-up face was red and panicked, horrified as the events were unfolding. Can't wait for the good part, eh?" The nurse smiled, showing her teeth. Tonya's heart skipped a beat. She was not ready for that smile. Her teeth were pitch black, shiny and clean, yes, but black, just like the midnight. "These are your lifelines, dear sinners. Do not feel great about your good health as you stand there. The bodies in the bed are a better representation of your lives. If they die, you die. Yet, the task is simple. Your alternate body has been inflicted by a deadly poison. The darker your sins, the more gruesome the poison. You must identify it using your skills and cure yourself. There is a catch, however. You must cure yourself before your time runs out." "You think you can intimidate us all, yeah?" Alex shouted, looking at his body. "Well, I want out. I'm not going to be a part of this sickly game." The nurse walked back to her place slowly, sitting down on a chair next to the IV station. "Your call, son." With a determined look on his face, Alex Torres picked up his bag and walked defiantly towards the door. Tonya and the rest watched him get farther away, their hearts beating fast. "Alex," Layla said, her voice wavering. "Something doesn't feel right about this. Come back so we can figure it out together. We will get out of this, I promise." Alex turned around to look at her. A tear streamed down his face. "Brody Facum," he whispered ever so lightly. "You said something?" Dr. Ellis asked. "I said Brody Facum." Alex pointed to his body lying weakly under Layla's shadow. Weakened vessels, blood leaking from the mouth, nostrils, eyes, ears. It all makes sense now. I can see how much pain I am in. I don't think I want to gamble stressfully and lose. I'd rather perish painlessly now. Tonya glanced at Alex's withered corpse-like body, bleeding from all the orifices. His half-closed eyes didn't even understand what was going on around him. She watched healthy Alex disappear beyond the front door as Layla rushed behind him, crying and shouting at him to come back. But he never did. He stepped beyond into the unknown, accepting whatever it was that waited for him. His body back in the ER was a different story altogether. The moment Alex Torres disappeared out of the hospital, his alternate self started to bleed faster, the blood becoming darker and pouring out thickly. The ER was quiet as they watched Alex flatline in horror. As soon as the last breath was taken, the stopwatch in the nurse's hand stopped ticking, and she stuffed it away in the folds of her dress. She then pulled the sheet over Alex's head, covering his corpse away forever and wheeling it outside. Tonya was the first to move, and although she was stressed, it wasn't going to pull her down in despair. She was a fighter. She could do this. She rushed towards her alternate self lying half-conscious and terribly restless next to Marcus. "Tonya, he began. "Go, Marcus. Tend to yourself. We don't have much time." She looked around and spotted Marcus's body lying in the corner, convulsing and spasming violently. It was a disturbing sight indeed. She was grateful that he'd left immediately. She didn't want to see her eyes that had welled up with tears, watching herself dying like this. She had been unloved all her childhood, and had strived to be where she was today as an esteemed doctor. She did not deserve the pain. "Hey," she whispered, her voice breaking up as she spoke to herself. Her alternate self wriggled restlessly, mumbling words deliriously and vomiting slightly. It was a pity to watch. Clearing out her head immediately, Tonya got to work, determined to figure out what had caused her to be like this. She quickly wiped off the vomit and gloved and masked herself, examining the unhealthy body. Her heartbeat was thrice that of a normal person, and she was sweating uncontrollably, her saliva drooling out miserably. Tonya worked on her, spiraling into confusion. Those were all general symptoms. She looked at the patient closely, at the way she thrust her tongue against her closed lips aggressively. It was unusual. Tonya grabbed a pair of tweezers and pried her mouth open with some force, determined to see what it was. Suddenly, something wet and white in color flickered on her tongue. She grabbed it roughly with her tweezers, pulling it out and holding it up in the light. Tonya's heart sank as she analyzed the object. Small lacy petals, bright white in color, just like a delicate lace. Hemlock. "Prof. Eric? Prof. Eric, I need the oxygen mask, please. Can you pass the trolley, please? It's right next to you." The old man didn't reply. Instead, he stared down at the bed in front of him, not moving a muscle. Something bizarre was going on. Intrigued, Tonya walked calmly towards him to see what it was. "Prof," she stopped mid-sentence. The sight before her eyes was gruesome and graphic indeed. The body that lay in front of them was on the verge of death, and in some ways, it was terrifying that it was still alive. It was the worst case out of all. A mass of unrecognizable burnt flesh was all that lay in front of them, melting and mutilated. It was untouchable indeed, as it was quite literally falling apart like boiled meat. Blood and fluid-soaked sheets lay under it as Prof. Eric's alternative self gasped for air, too stunned in pain to make any noise. "What is it?" Tonya asked him quietly. "Radiation." Prof. Eric removed his glasses and put them in his chest pocket, looking over to his son Andrew, who stood motionless, crestfallen. "An extremely high dose of radiation, child. I do not know how to salvage this. Whatever I touch falls apart." I lifted his arm, but the flesh was stuck to the pillow and the bone came away clean. "He cannot be saved. I cannot be saved." Tonya was horrified. Her heart raced as she observed the wretched being in front of them. Her eyes met those of the nurse behind the bed, who looked back at her solemnly. Not knowing what to do, she quietly grabbed an oxygen mask from the trolley next to him and walked away. "Shh," she cooed at herself, holding her alternate self's hand as she deliriously resisted the oxygen mask covering her face. Yet, she calmed down almost immediately as she realized that the mask helped her breathe better. As Tonya stabilized herself, she sat down. Her vitals were normal for the time being, and the fluids were pumping into her body, yet only time would tell if the prognosis would be good or not. "Please help!" Layla suddenly screamed. Tonya looked up to a grievous Dr. Ellis and Andrew frantically pacing around Layla, who stood there with her hands cupped over her mouth. "Do something quickly, I beg you." Tonya rushed to her bedside to observe the situation. It was grievous indeed as Tonya sucked her breath in. A burned Layla lay sprawled on the bed, lifeless and unconscious, her skin mottled green and blue with yellow blobs of fat exposed to the harsh air. "It's a nitric acid burn," Dr. Ellis muttered, injecting a syringe full of liquid into her veins. The monitor above her beeped alarmingly, showing that all her vitals were off. The nurse standing behind her glared eerily at the stopwatch, which was ticking faster than usual. "We need the crash cart immediately," Andrew muttered. "It's in the minor OT right outside in the hall," Dr. Ellis pointed. "Andrew, Tonya, you both retrieve it. The professor and Marcus will help me handle her meanwhile." As she ran out of the room with Andrew to get the crash cart, her eye caught a glimpse of the world beyond the huge glass doors. "Andrew, go get it," she said, unable to take her eyes off the scene. Andrew scuttled away, desperately in search of the cart while Tonya stood there, hypnotized. The world outside seemed straight out of space, with hundreds and thousands of stars whistling downwards. Or maybe they were going upwards. It was breathtaking nonetheless, and Tonya was awestruck. Even the border between the dead and the living world was beautiful, she thought. "Tonya, I know you're mesmerized, but we're stuck in a situation here, yeah?" Andrew said, painstakingly dragging the crash cart through the corridor. Tonya broke her train of thought and turned away from the beautiful curtain of purgatory beyond the glass walls, ready to focus on what was necessary. The ER was a mess from within. Layla sat on the floor against the bed in which her alternate self lay, slowly drifting away into the dark void. Marcus looked up at Tonya with those gorgeous dew eyes that pleaded for help as she entered with Andrew. Tonya could see that the situation was dire. The flesh that had sizzled, contracted, and burned away occasionally gave off the fumes of burning tissues, something that made Tonya nauseous. The real Layla wasn't doing too well either. Her forehead had broken into a cold sweat and her eyes were half closed as Marcus fanned her with a piece of cardboard. She was slipping away too, bit by bit, as Dr. Ellis and the professor aggressively tried to save her. "We have to puncture the lungs. There's too much fluid inside. We need to drain it out." Dr. Ellis removed her glasses, masking herself and preparing to go invasive. "I agree with you. Let me assist in this." The old professor seemed adamant about helping her out of this. But in his eyes, Tonya could see life slipping away too. He looked tired as his alternate self lay behind him, nothing but a tattered yet breathing mess of shredded flesh. The darker your sins are, the more gruesome the poison. Tonya wondered what it was that this seemingly innocent man had done that had brought him to such a miserable fate. Tonya's train of thought was broken by a painful and deadly scream that had just exited Layla's mouth. She clutched her chest and howled loudly, her eyes threatening to pop out. I know, Dr. Ellis said, her voice wavering as she cut through the eska on Layla's torso. Spurts of blood flew into the air as she made her way into the chest cavity. "We need to hurry, Alice," the professor said, eyeing the monitor above them that was going crazy. Nothing was right about Layla. Her heart was beating too fast and then too slow, and her blood pressure fluctuated dangerously. Suddenly, Layla flatlined. The ticking of the stopwatch ceased. "She's going into arrhythmia," Dr. Ellis said, retrieving a defibrillator from the crash cart amid the real Layla's anguished howls. She charged it before pressing it against the burnt torso of the poor woman, shocking her up, but it didn't work. The dreadful noise of the flatline dragged through the silence. "Dad, do something!" Andrew shouted desperately at the old man who looked down at the ground. Below the bed, Layla had fallen into a deep void out of which she was not to be woken. Marcus had stepped away from her, not knowing what to do next. Andrew crouched on the floor next to her body, whimpering grievously over it. It was hard to watch. Tonya felt suffocated. She went outside into the lobby, where the shooting stars were visible from behind the glass. They made her feel safe. She spent a moment thinking about Layla, how she despised her at times out of pure jealousy. Layla was perfect, and Tonya was not. Now that the former had departed, Tonya felt nothing but a hollow vacuum of pain. The real world beyond the glass pane looked like a fever dream. Tonya couldn't point out what it was, but she wanted to go outside and let the darkness consume her whole, to let it wrap her in its cold embrace. But life was made to live. Soon she heard a wailing sound behind her. Layla's alternate body was being brought out by the strange nurse. The real Layla lay lifelessly in Andrew's arms as he helplessly followed the nurse. His eyes were swollen and red from the tears. "Farewell, sweet Layla," Tonya said, patting her head as Andrew walked towards the door. The nurse opened it and turned around, whispering something in Andrew's ears. Andrew looked at her miserably and set the body in his arms next to the alternate one on the bed, acknowledging that he was not to step beyond the door into the next realm. Just like that, the nurse took Layla and stepped out into the unknown, letting the whizzing stars that passed by embrace them in a cloud of silvery dust as their forms faded out of view. Back in the ER, the tense scenario was alleviated a little by the temporary stability of those who lay in bed. Andrew, Tonya, Dr. Ellis, Prof. Eric, and Marcus all sat on the floor, eating bland snacks from the vending machine. The hospital was a good otherworldly copy of the one back in the mortal realm, but a strange one too. The canteen that was usually always full of people and doctors was quiet and empty, with nothing but monotonous chairs lying still in the dead darkness. It was clearly a scheme to make them stay within the ER or immediately beyond it. "What do you guys think happens when we die?" Andrew asked, looking back at the body laying on his bed that was battling a severe anthrax infection and was therefore intubated. "We get questioned, son. We pay for what we do," the professor smiled. "Well," Dr. Ellis added, wiping the crumbs of chocolate biscuit off her face, "we're kind of dead here, so something must definitely exist. In the end, we all get what's coming to us." "Nah, man," Marcus said. "That's just darkness. I kinda like that. It's like lying in the dark night under a sky full of stars, not a single other person there with you. It must be better to have someone." Tonya looked down at her hands, at the chafed, peeling skin from all the nitric acid that had oozed out of Layla's wounds. She felt an intense ache in her heart whenever she met Marcus's blue eyes. It was a bittersweet feeling of longing that would never lead anywhere, especially not now when all of them faced death. Suddenly, out of nowhere, loud instrumental music blared from deep within the depths of the hospital, shaking the walls and all the beds that were lined in the room. "Guys," Tonya said, looking around at the nurses who looked down with sullen expressions on their faces. "What's happening?" "Another development in this morbid joke, that's what's happening." The professor's face seemed strained as a sweat broke out on his forehead. He was clearly in pain. "It's Beethoven. Symphony No. 9. Where is it blaring from?" Andrew asked. "This isn't good." Dr. Ellis wiped the professor's head with her handkerchief. "How are you feeling?" "Not good," the professor replied, clutching his chest. Andrew held him as he flopped on the ground like a rag doll. On the bed, his alternate self gasped and spluttered blood. Tonya got up quickly to see what the instability was up there. The sight was horrific indeed. She'd seen brutal car accidents where the victims were practically shredded up, and this was no different. She observed him closely, looking at the strands of muscle and fat on his body that were literally falling apart. The sheets were soaked underneath, and he was stuck to them. No way would it be possible to remove them without large chunks of his flesh coming off too. When Tonya saw what the problem was, her heart sank. His windpipe was completely exposed in his neck, and little holes had started to develop in it. He was finding it hard to breathe. Yet, the eyes were alive. Old eyes, burnt and tired, yet very much awake and aware, feeling every bit of the agonizing pain, begging her to let him go. That was not the only problem though. On Marcus's bed, A different complication seemed to be developing right at the same forsaken time. There was a loud screeching sound as the real Marcus on the floor choked violently, his face turning purple, as Symphony No. 9 blared in the background, the climax speeding up as the events unfolded in the ER. His alternate self sat spasming in the bed, contorting forcefully in all sorts of positions, his poisoned muscles killing him from within. "We need to intubate Dad. Tonya, perform the Heimlich on our Marcus. Quick," Andrew said, dragging the crash car towards his father's bed. Panicking, Tonya rushed behind the now unconscious Marcus, who lay pitifully on the floor. As she lifted him, his muscles were abnormally stiff, not letting her perform the maneuver. She huffed and puffed in anxiety, desperately trying to push his lungs upward, but his stiffened abdominal muscles prevented her from making any progress. As Beethoven played away, things on the professor's bed weren't looking too good either. Hands shaking, Andrew had tried to insert a tube down his father's throat, but it was too fragile and powdery to do any good. Instead, his shivering hands caused 2 more perforations. "Give it to me." Dr. Ellis snatched the tube from Andrew's hands in desperation, focusing and trying to insert it properly. There was a wet, slicky sound as a painful and guttural groan came out of the patient's throat. Dr. Ellis had punctured his fragile lung. "What have you done?" Andrew screamed, stepping back and looking at the scene in horror. "What did you do? What the heck did you do?" "Andrew," the real professor yelled from the ground, "shut up and come here." In tears, Andrew knelt down next to his father, who pulled him into a sitting position. The professor then turned towards Tonya. "How's the Heimlich going, girl?" Not good," Tonya yelled, her flushed face dripping with the sheer effort. The professor said, turning feebly to face the eerie nurse that stood at the end of the bed, watching the stopwatch as it ticked away dangerously. "I'd like to make a bargain." "That is not allowed, I'm afraid. Exceptions have always been made. Negotiations have been taking place since the dawn of civilization. We have to make them as doctors. You must listen to me, please." The nurse checked the stopwatch. Although her face was nonchalant, her eyes widened slightly as she acknowledged the measly amount of time the old man had left. "State your last wish," she said finally. "Whatever feeble life is left in me, whatever light still burns inside my living chest, transfer it to this dying boy. Let him have another chance." "Dad, no!" Andrew cried, shaking his father by the shoulders. "You can't do this. You don't know what you're saying." The professor couldn't bring himself to look at him, staring instead at the nurse through eyes welled with hot tears. "I'd like to make a confession," the professor said firmly as his son, Tonya and Dr. Ellis watched silently, holding the limp body of Marcus. "I've lived for long enough with a nasty little secret, and it's about time that I let it be known to my son." "What are you saying, Dad?" Andrew stepped back, confused. "Look at my body. Look at others' bodies. See any difference?" The professor smiled sadly. "The state of me is an absolute mess. It is because of my own sins. I must wash them away before I turn to the cosmos." "Make your confession," the nurse stuffed the stopwatch away. The professor turned to Andrew and cupped his face, a tear running down his cheek. "I love your mother very much. She was to me what the moon is to the sky. When you were born, she was elevated. She adored you endlessly, but there was love lacking in her life. I wasn't there for her. She was all alone, raising you while I hustled and earned money to be able to afford the life I wanted us to live. By the time I got there, she had dived into the harsh depths of loneliness. How much can a human mind bear? It was just her doing chores all day long. I had failed to be there for her. As time passed, she fell deeper into the void she had entered. Ultimately, she broke down completely, and I was still in the illusion of my youth. Pride made me send her away, deeming her incapable of being with me and my son. She stayed at a psychiatric institution for many years, until your 16th birthday actually, before finally passing away. She spent all those years alone, in utter confusion about what was happening, calling out my name and asking where her son was. I could not visit her more than twice. I used to tell myself that I was too busy, but the truth was, my guilt slowly gnawed at me, eating me up from within like a festering wound. The truth is, the man lying on the bed is my truest face, my realest condition. I am nothing but a sad mass of flesh, living in misery. Andrew stared at his dad in horror. His jaw hung down as he tried to process all the information he had just been told. But you told me she passed away in a car accident. You've been lying to me my entire life. The professor looked down, clearly ashamed. What are we if not a tangle of pathetic mistakes? Your time is up. The nurse appeared from the bed, interrupting the professor. Stop! No! Don't do it, Dad! You're so selfish! You left Mom and now you want to leave me forever too! How can you be this cruel? You don't need me, son. All parents let go of their children's hands one day. For us, that day is today. I mean, look at me. I'm a tragedy. Let me reunite with your mother so I can beg at her feet for forgiveness. My whole life I have lived in guilt. Set me free. I'm removing the intubation, Dr. Ellis called from the bed, holding the tube gingerly, as it blew a measly quantity of air into the professor's lungs. It was a pitiful sight indeed. Don't you dare do it, Ellis, Andrew thundered, his voice edging dangerously. Free me. The professor closed his eyes. Andrew scampered towards Dr. Ellis, yelling and threatening to hurt her if she unplugged the decomposing body lying helplessly on the bed. Get away from that plug or I'll rip you apart. I don't care if you're my boss or whatever. This is not your decision to make. The decision has been made already, and I respect it. Goodbye, Professor. It has been a pleasure working with you. See you on the other side. Bidding him farewell, Dr. Ellis pulled the tube and shut off the life support. Andrew let out a menacing scream as the life support machine died down. You filthy sadist! I'm going to destroy you! Quiet! The professor's nurse yelled dominantly. She glared at Andrew for a second before slowly heading towards Marcus's bed, where the latter lay lifelessly with his arms limp and his eyes turned back into his head. She fished out the professor's stopwatch from her pocket and handed it over to Marcus's nurse. Quisque moritur milies, one said to the other, closing her eyes and pressing the stopwatch in her palm. What the hell are you doing? What are you saying? Andrew screamed, the corners of his mouth frothing up. His emotional situation seemed to be deteriorating rapidly as he found it particularly difficult to accept everything his father had told him, only to die soon thereafter. Stay put, the professor's nurse said, placing the body of the real professor alongside the decaying mass of flesh on the bed, with the help of Dr. Ellis. Your time will come too. As the nurse wheeled the professor out to be mixed with the stardust of the cosmos, Andrew sat down against the wall, thinking deeply about everything that had just happened. His eyes darted here and there, unable to accept the truth. He hated everything that happened. He resented his father for lying to him. He resented him for leaving so easily. But most of all, he hated Ellis. Oh! A voice echoed through the room. The lean body of Marcus weakly stirred around, struggling to get up. He was very much alive, very much breathing, all at the cost of the professor's life and his sins. A bout of nausea took over him for being dead for quite a few minutes, and the young man retched all over the floor, wrenching his guts out. Marcus! Toya leaped to her feet, rubbing his back and helping him breathe properly. Oh goodness, he's breathing, Dr. Ellis. Put his face downwards. Don't let anything aspirate into his lungs, Tonya. You're okay, Marcus. You're okay. I'll get you water, okay? Just relax. Take a deep breath. Tonya turned Marcus onto his stomach and got up, rushing outside to get a bottle of water from the vending machine. Dr. Ellis scampered towards Marcus, cooing at him and whispering words of encouragement to the young doctor. Andrew Robertson watched his mentor and his best friend listen to each other as he sat all alone in the corner of the room, his back against the wall. A seething anger was beginning to flame up somewhere deep inside him, and the embers had already been rooted into his heart. He reminisced how easily Dr. Ellis had pulled the plug away without the slightest hesitation, as if his father was nothing but a mere disposable life, whereas in reality he was the one who had built the entire hospital. Without him, Dr. Ellis would be begging around the other hospitals at this age. After doing the heinous deed that she did, not a single apology came from her. No, nothing at all, as if Andrew just didn't exist. Andrew got up, every single cell in his body loathing him for what he was about to do. Some hatred was too much to measure, and the anger in him had developed for too long, too quietly. It could not be extinguished. He remembered his mother, his smiling mother, and his heart screamed silently at how she had endured so many years at a mental institution, waiting in desperation for someone to rescue her, all the while her son, oblivious that his mother was alive, roamed around without a care in the world. All that pent-up anger seemed to be targeted at one person, Dr. Ellis. He couldn't get the image of her out of his head, the nonchalance with which she had carried out the deed. His father wasn't there anymore to get the hit of his anger. He had left him like a selfish person, unwilling to converse with his son about the sins he had done. He turned to the crash cart. The lowest drawer was filled with packaged and sterilized surgical equipment. In the harsh light of the ER, a brand new scalpel glinted provocatively at him, begging him to do the unthinkable. He picked it up and tore off the package. "Here, have some water," Tonya said, giving the bottle to Marcus. Dr. Ellis had her back turned on Andrew, oblivious to what was about to happen. "Hey, Doc!" Andrew sneered ragingly, his face curled into a snarl. Dr. Ellis turned around and looked at Andrew, who glared down at her. How small and insignificant she looked, how ugly the glint of pride in her eyes was. Andrew imagined someone exactly like Dr. Ellis pinning his mother down when she must have acted out in her despair and confusion. "Andrew, what are you—" The blade worked faster than Dr. Ellis could finish her sentence. There was a sharp slick as beads of blood in a straight line appeared on Dr. Ellis's neck. As she moved her head, a stream of blood began to pour down, staining her scrubs scarlet. "Andrew, what have you done?" Tonya screamed, pressing against Dr. Ellis's neck, trying to stop the bleeding. Marcus looked at the scene through bloodshot eyes in confusion, unable to understand what was going on. He finally put two and two together, looking at his best friend in shock and disgust. "Why?" he asked, looking at the boy he'd known since kindergarten, wondering when he'd died, and this one had taken his place. Andrew was unrecognizable. "Dr. Ellis, Doc, please stay with me. I'm going to do something, okay?" Tonya got up and opened the cabinets in the ER, searching for stitches. What she didn't know was that Andrew had sliced deeply with the intention to kill. Her windpipe was cut cleanly in half, and no amount of stitches would fix that. The stopwatch held in the nurse's hand quickened up, speeding dangerously as the ticks blurred together. As they hit Tonya's ears, she hurried, searching for material faster, fooling herself with reassurance that she was trying hard, although a feeble little voice in her head told her that Dr. Ellis was gone. "Andrew, don't do anything stupid now," Marcus croaked weakly. He dragged himself across the floor to where his best friend sat in despair, looking at what he had done. A moment of clarity had passed through Andrew's mind. He looked at Dr. Ellis's betrayed eyes that stared at him with a mixture of fear and pain, not understanding how the saver of lives had turned into the taker of one. As Tonya opened the glass cabinets, Andrew looked at himself in the reflection. He was unrecognizable. His face was twisted into a wild snarl with angry eyes full of tears. His peers stared at him with disgust and horror on their faces. He was no longer Andrew Robertson. There was no going back now. Unable to leave with his mind, Andrew dug the bloody scalpel deep into his wrist, letting the blood pour out. He gasped for a second, shocked at the sight of so much blood pouring out of his body, and hyperventilated soon after. Yet he knew he had to continue. Through his panic, he forced himself to slash the other arm as well, taking a deep breath as sitting back as he started to feel colder and lonelier. The world around him darkening and getting blurry, feeling his scrubs get wetter as the life poured out of his body. Tick, tock, tick, tock, tick. Not one, but 2 stopwatches stopped ticking abruptly this time, leaving the ER in an eerie silence. Marcus's screams were fruitless as Andrew and Dr. Ellis lay on the floor, lifeless, eyes open, a look of despair on their faces. All was lost. Tonya and Marcus sat in the lobby soon thereafter, looking around at the silent hospital. There was a trail of blood leading out of the ER as the remnants of Dr. Ellis and Andrew were dragged across the lobby toward the entrance by the nurses. It was an eerie sight indeed, yet even through the signs of violence that remained, Tonya felt a wave of calmness wash over her. The cool air blowing out of the AC, the softness of Marcus's face, the presence of not another soul in the realm apart from them both. Tonya relished every bit of it. The slow signs of decay, however, were obvious. No world was permanent, and like all realities, this one was threatening to come to an end. Somewhere in the past hour, bits and pieces of the hospital, the glass planes, some sofas in the lobby, the vending machine, had all been vacuumed away into the breeze of the cosmos as it whipped past them. "Have you ever heard of the Noodle Man?" Marcus asked her, looking deep into her eyes as they sat at the entrance, watching the stardust and planets whiz past in the distance. "No," Tonya responded, a dazzling smile on her face. It was a smile that told him all would be good. "Well," he began, his blue eyes twinkling, "there was once a noodle man who sold noodles on the streets of his village. He was really poor, but the highlight of his day was this one woman who brought his noodles every single morning. She smiled at him, told him his noodles were the best, and thanked him before leaving. Soon, the noodle man started his own business and became quite rich. But his heart yearned for the sight of her once more. Wherever he went, he could not get the thought of her out of his head, so he returned back to his village to see her one more time. He started selling noodles again at the very same spot for many years, waiting for her to run into him again one day. He could finally tell her that he made it in life and that he loved her and that he had come back to get her so they could be together forever. But, alas, it was too late, and she was nowhere to be seen. Too many years had passed. He could not find her. The noodle man waited for her until he, too, disappeared from the world. Till his last day he searched for her. Till his last breath he remembered her face. It is said that sometimes, when the nights are really quiet, one can hear them laughing in the stars, sharing their love over a bowl of noodles. Tonya stared at Marcus, her heart hurting. They'd known each other for all of their residency years, yet none of them had the strength or time to tell the other their real feelings, thinking that they'd do it when the time was right. Here they were now, sitting at the edge of the cosmos, at the end of time, looking at each other, speaking a million words through their eyes, all unsaid. "You should leave now," Marcus said, holding her hand close to his chest. "What? Why? This isn't over yet, Marcus. The test is still going on." Marcus chuckled lightly, noticing 1,000 freckles on her face. They were all beautiful. "Look around you, Tonya. Don't you get it? It's all over. The place is breaking and falling apart." "Yes, and that's great. In a short time we'll both be leaving," Tonya pleaded in front of him, her heart brimming with love and confusion. "That's not how it works," Marcus said softly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "There is only one winner. The ticking of only one stopwatch sets us free from this celestial prison." "Then let it be me," Tonya said defiantly, a tear streaking down her cheek. "I can't let you do this. Please." "No, it must be me. I must leave now. I can feel that my end is near." My clock is running out of all its stocks. Marcus chuckled. Tonya looked at him angrily. What about the stopwatch the professor gave to you, sacrificing his life in the process? You're just going to let that go to waste? Marcus stared at the lovely little face in front of him. The little brow furrow, the frown of desperation, the eyes that were filled with love for him. He hated himself for waiting till death, when he could have done this much earlier in life. It hasn't gone to waste. In fact, I use them better than I used my own time in life. The professor let me have a little extra time with you. I will always be grateful to him for this. We don't have to do anything, Marcus. We can both just stay right here and see what happens. Whatever it is, we'll be in it together. No, Tonya, Marcus said, cupping her face. I want you to go and live a long and very colorful life. It should be rich and full of laughter. I want you to live it all. We both cannot go. This place will cease to exist when only one stopwatch remains. I've lived enough, seen enough. I come from a rich family. There's nothing I didn't experience. I want you to live it all too. Somewhere along the line, you will fall in love once more, and it will last you a lifetime. Tonya opened her mouth to reason with him. Shh, he said, before she could utter a word. Never forget me. As the hospital slowly started to wither around them, Marcus let go of her hand, walking towards the entrance of the lobby, looking out at how beautiful the stars were. He hoped they would lead him to nowhere, or somewhere far away where he could drift soullessly through the cosmos, unaware of his existence. Tonya watched him go from the lobby, her palms flat against the glass walls. She watched him face the curtains of stars whizzing past. Marcus stopped before he could step through, looking back one last time with the brightest smile on his face. I love you. As Tonya whispered the words back to him, Marcus stepped through the veil, letting the chaos embrace him fully, as he surrendered himself to it. There was no blood, no violence, no regret. There was no anger or misery. There was only contentment. The minutes dragged by slowly as Tonya felt the breeze sift through her hair. She looked at the empty husk of this reality that lay around her, contemplating how surreal it felt. The empty rooms, the broken ceiling that showed the cosmos beyond, the trails of blood that spoke of misery and pain, they were all around her. A bout of slumber crept into her as the pieces of reality around her started to crumble away. Sleep, she told herself. Through her woozy vision, she saw her nurse approaching her with a smile on her face, holding the stopwatch in her hands. The ticking of it echoed throughout the cosmos deafeningly, putting Tonya into a sleep-like trance. Soon, there was nothing but darkness. Wake up, Tonya. Wake up. Pain was all she felt. It was agonizing, wave-like, and burned right through her. She wanted to drift back to sleep, but her nerves screamed in terror, begging her to see what it was that was destroying her. Wake up, Tonya! A sound, a distant, feminine sound echoed through her mind, coming from a faraway tunnel. Gasp. She was awake. A sharp light blinded her eyes as she squinted in pain, every single pore of her body in discomfort. She could feel nothing but weakness. It was as if she had dried up. Mom, she croaked, the hair on her arm standing up at the sound of her own voice. Why was it so dead and raspy, like the croak of a frog? My lifeline, my darling, my everything, her mom cried, looking at her daughter with love. You're awake, finally. After 5 years, my Tonya is back.